Hello everyone, welcome to another video. In this video, I'll finally be talking about the latest melee being added with Endwalker, the extremely frustrated botanist, Reaper. I'll go over its kit while giving more detailed opinions about certain aspects of its kit, as well as some other stuff. As always, the media tour disclaimers you've probably heard a million times by now still applies here. Let's not waste any more time. Reaper has 3 gauges to manage: the Soul gauge, used to activate avatar abilities, and the Shroud gauge, used to activate and shroud its burst phase. Its 3rd gauge, the Lemire gauge, is activated within the Shroud windows. It provides information on how much Lemire Shroud, the blue orbs, and White Shroud, the red orbs, you have. Slice, Waxen Slice into Inferno Slice. This is just your standard 1, 2, 3, each gives 10 soul gauge. Soul Slice hits just as hard as Inferno Slice at 460 potency and instantly grants 50 soul gauge. It has 2 charges with a 30-second charge time, and it shares its recast with its AoE equivalent, Soul Scythe. Harp, your ranged attack, it's a spell with a 1.3 second cast time, deals 300 potency damage. Now Reaper doesn't have a dot, but it has Shadow of Death. This does the same damage as Slice at 300 potency, but more importantly, it afflicts Death's Design, making you deal 10% more damage for 30 seconds. This can stack up to 60 seconds. Obviously you want to use this all the time, because I don't think anyone doesn't like doing 10% more damage in this game. It also grants 10 soul gauge when the target dies. Spinning Scythe into Nightmare Scythe. Basic 1-2 AoE combo, each gives 10 soul gauge. Soul Scythe, the AoE equivalent of Soul Slice, also instantly grants 50 soul gauge and has 2 charges with a 30-second charge time. Whirl of Death. This is the AoE equivalent to Shadow of Death. It has the same function as Shadow of Death, so you want this up all the time during AoE. More importantly, getting 10 soul gauge after the death of an enemy is way more enticing in AoE situations. Soul grants you access to Harvest Moon when used. It has no cast time out of combat, but in combat the cast time is 5 seconds. This ability is a bit weird to me, and I just have this feeling that it will be reworked eventually. I understand that it's supposed to be Reaper's downtime tool, but it really reminds me of how Samurai's Shoha used to be. In case you don't know, Shoha was only accessible after using Meditate. Meditate could stack up to 5 times, and the longer you meditated for, the more powerful it got, up to a maximum of 400 potency. It got reworked in 5.1 to what it is today. Granted, So is definitely better than old Shoha, but it's just funny to me that they brought back a similar skill into the game post Shoha rework. We'll just have to see what the future holds for this skill. Harvest Moon, a 600 potency insta-cast spell on the first enemy with 50% AoE fall off. One of your harder hits and abilities, you will also use this for single target. I've talked about soul gauge accumulation a lot, but what do you spend it on exactly? Blood Stalk, a 400 potency OGCD that costs 50 soul gauge. This grants 1 stack of a new resource, Soul Reaver. I'll get to Soul Reaver in more detail soon. Gluttony, a 500 potency OGCD on the first enemy with 25% AoE fall off on a 60-second cooldown. Costs 50 soul gauge to use and grants 2 stacks of Soul Reaver. You'll want to use this in both single target and AoE situations. Now what do you spend Soul Reavers on? Your Shroud gauge generators. This is when we start getting a little more complicated. Gallows and Gibbet. These 2 GCDs are essentially the same skill. They both cost 1 Soul Reaver to use, both grant you 10 Shroud gauge per use, and they're both 460 potency at their respective positionals and 520 potency when enhanced. Yeah, Reaper actually has positionals. I went a long time without mentioning positionals for melee, but here they are. Gallows is for the rear and Gibbet is for the flank. Now I mentioned something about enhancement. Essentially when you use one, you gain a one-time buff for 60 seconds that enhances the damage of the sister skill. So using Gallows will boost Gibbet's potency from 460 to 520, and vice versa. Bloodstalk also turns into Unveiled Gibbet if you use Gallows, or Unveiled Gallows if you use Gibbet. Although their functions are the same as Bloodstalk, so don't worry about the name change. They just did this to have some variety in animation. For AoE, you will use Guillotine, a 200 potency attack to generate 10 Shroud. To generate Soul Reavers in AoE, you use Grim Swath instead of Bloodstalk. Grim Swath is a 100 potency Coldal AoE that grants 1 Soul Reaver. Something very important to keep in mind, Bloodstalk and Unveiled Gibbet and Gallows by extension provide 1 Soul Reaver and can only provide 1 Soul Reaver. If you have 1 Soul Reaver already and you use one of these skills, you will not gain a second Soul Reaver. The only way to gain more than 1 Soul Reaver is by using Gluttony every 60 seconds, which provides 2 Soul Reavers. If you do not bear this in mind, you can easily waste Soul Reavers. It was designed this way to prevent players from generating Shroud too fast, since you can generate 50 Soul way faster than Gluttony coming off cooldown. The rule of thumb is, when you use Gluttony, you will want to spend both Soul Reavers before using either Unveiled Gibbet or Unveiled Gallows. So your Soul Reaver count should be 2, 1, 0, 1, 0. This will unfortunately let you waste the use of an Unveiled Gibbet or Unveiled Gallows, but the benefit to this is that you will not waste any Soul Reaver stacks and gain 30 Shroud instead of 20. Let's talk about Reaper's raid buff, as it has an interesting dynamic tied to it. Arcane Circle, this is the raid damage buff. It increases all damage to self and the party by 3% for 20 seconds and is on a 2-minute cooldown. Arcane Circle also grants Circle of Sacrifice to self and the party for 5 seconds, and Blood Sworn Circle to just yourself for 6 seconds. Circle of Sacrifice allows you and the party to generate 1 Immortal Sacrifice every time a weapon skill or spell lands. Immortal Sacrifice stacks up to 8 times. Blood Sworn Circle allows you to accumulate stacks of Immortal Sacrifice from the party under the effect of your Circle of Sacrifice. Now, for those who've played Monk, this sounds awfully familiar to Brotherhood. Essentially, Arcane Circle provides all these effects just to make sure that if you have 2 or more Reapers in the party for whatever reason, every Reaper can gain Immortal Sacrifice stacks, but cannot stack the damage buff. In Brotherhood's case, during its early days before its effects were split to Brotherhood's 5% damage buff and Meditative Brotherhood's Chakra Siphoning, both effects fell just under the Brotherhood buff. This means if you had 2 or more monks in the party and one of them overrode your Brotherhood, you couldn't siphon Chakra from the party anymore because you just lost the buff. Obviously, this was freaking terrible, hence why they changed it. So now you have all these Immortal Sacrifice stacks. What do you use them on? Plentiful Harvest. This is a line AoE GCD with a potency of 520 on the first enemy with 60% AoE fall off. It requires 1 Immortal Sacrifice to use, but the potency scales up to 800 depending on the amount of Immortal Sacrifice stacks you have. It's powerful, but that's not the main reason why you would use this. It also instantly grants 50 Shroud, allowing you to immediately enter an Enshroud phase afterwards. Something to keep in mind, as long as you have the Blood Sown Circle buff, you cannot use Plentiful Harvest. This was done to prevent you from using Plentiful Harvest numerous times when acquiring Immortal Sacrifice stacks during the 6-second Blood Sown Circle window. Even with only 1 Immortal Sacrifice, Plentiful Harvest will still hit just as hard as an Enhanced Gibbet or Enhanced Gallows. Time to talk about Reaper's Burst phase and Shroud. And Shroud lets the avatar possess the Reaper, giving you access to 5 Lemure Shroud on the Lemure gauge. It has a 15-second cooldown and costs 50 Shroud to activate. And Shroud alters certain abilities, Gibbet and Gallows into Void Reaping and Cross Reaping, Guillotine into Grim Reaping, and Bloodstalk and Grim Swath into Lemir's Slice and Lemir's Scythe. For single target, you will use Void Reaping, Cross Reaping, and Lemir's Slice. Much like Gibbet and Gallows, using Void Reaping will enhance Cross Reaping's damage, and vice versa. Void and Cross Reaping are 460 potency base and 520 when enhanced, have no positionals, and are 1.5 second GCDs. They both cost 1 Lemure Shroud to use, and both grant 1 Void Shroud per use. Lemir's Slice is a 200 potency OGCD that costs 2 Void Shroud to use. For AoE, you will use Grim Reaping. This is a 200 potency cone AoE 1.5 second GCD that costs 1 Lemure Shroud to use and generates 1 Void Shroud per use. Lemir's Scythe is a 100 potency AoE OGCD that costs 2 Void Shroud to use. For single target, you will proceed with Void Cross Slice, Void Cross Slice. For AoE, you will proceed with Grim Scythe, Grim Scythe. The final Lemure Shroud is spent on Communio, a 1000 potency nuke on the first enemy with a 1.3 second cast time and 60% AoE falloff. Communio instantly ends Enshroud upon execution, so it can be used earlier in the Enshroud rotation depending on the situation. For example, the boss dying before you can get through the entire Enshroud rotation. Lastly, let's talk about Reaper's utilities and traits. Hell's Ingress and Hell's Egress. Ingress makes you dash 15 yards forward, and Egress makes you dash 15 yards backwards. They both have a 20-second cooldown. Using Ingress turns Egress into Regress, and vice versa. Regress allows you to return to the Hell's Gate left behind by you. When Hell's Ingress or Hell's Egress are used, it allows the next harp to have no cast time as well. Yeah, that was very hard to say. Arcane Crest allows you to cast Crest of Time Borrowed, a barrier on yourself equated to 10% of your max HP. The barrier lasts 5 seconds and has a 30-second cooldown. If the barrier is broken, it will grant Crest of Time Returned, granting a 15-second 100 potency regen to everyone within 15 yards of you. You unlock the Soul Gauge at level 50. You unlock some potency buffs to your basic GCDs at level 60. You unlock the Soul Reaver resource when landing Bloodstalk or Grim Swath at level 70. You unlock the ability to use Regress after using Hell's Ingress or Hell's Egress at level 74. You gain a second charge to Soul Slice and Soul Scythe at level 78. You unlock the Shroud Gauge at level 80. You unlock the Regen effect when Arcane Crest breaks at level 84. You unlock Void, Cross, and Grim Reaping, granting Void Shroud at level 76. And lastly, you unlock Circle of Sacrifice and Blood Sown Circle effects on Arcane Circle at level 88. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about some potential tech for Shroud Gauge and Shroud Management. This info comes courtesy of Rin Karigani's Reaper Rotation Spreadsheet. Now, massive disclaimer. Please do not take this as gospel. There are so many variables that will affect the feasibility of this tech, such as final adjustments, fight-specific downtime, and specific kill times, that this will most likely not be a thing that people will do at all in the end once Endwalker is out and has some time on it. I just want to talk about it right now because it's interesting and it's fun to theorycraft and speculate. That's all. Now, with that out of the way, let's actually talk about this tech. The tech is sacrificing one of your earlier Enshroud windows to perform a third Enshroud window at the 6-minute mark. With the way Reaper is designed, you should naturally generate about 50 Shroud a minute with proper play. This means that after your Enshroud phase in the opener, you should be able to enter Enshroud again a minute later. However, instead of doing that, you skip that Enshroud phase and bank the 50 Shroud. Around your 2-minute window, you should have 100 Shroud. You will spend 50 Shroud for your first Enshroud phase and then enter it again with Plentiful Harvest. By the end of both windows, you will still have 50 Shroud remaining. This will be repeated for the 4-minute Enshroud phase. At 3 minutes, you will want to enter a single Enshroud phase to prevent Shroud overcap, since you will have 100 Shroud gauge at this point. Finally, at the 6-minute mark, this is where pots are used and the big reopener occurs. You will enter 2 Enshroud phases back to back by spending 50 Shroud and using Plentiful Harvest, much like the other 2-minute windows. Except this time, you will now also spend the 50 Shroud you banked at the 1-minute mark to enter a third Enshroud phase. That's basically the tech. But keep in mind that this third Shroud phase will not fall under pot timings, because at this point, your pot should have fallen off. Now once again, please take this with a grain of salt. I'm just talking about the possibility. This also doesn't consider whether a ninja will be in the group or not, since that's the only DPS in the game, post Endwalker anyway, that will still have a raid buff once every minute with Trick Attack. In that situation, it may be probable to enter Enshroud at the 1-minute mark, since Trick will be up instead of skipping that Enshroud phase. But there's no point delving into that any deeper without final numbers and proper math from people way smarter than I am, so I'm just gonna stop here. I'll post the spreadsheet in the description if you want to check it out for yourselves. And with that, I have said everything I needed to say about Reaper. It looks like it'll have some solid depth, it's very flashy, and ultimately looks extremely fun to play. I think the team did an awesome job creating this job, and I'm very curious to see how it performs in high-end content. If you made it this far, then I offer my sincere thanks for watching through it all. If you liked it, please like the video. If you didn't, a dislike is fine too. Expect more Endwalker content when it finally drops, and with that, I'm out. See ya.